How you going, crew? You got Taco here. So this gun debate thing that's been going on, gun reform in Australia, being a shooter, avid shooter myself, find it a little bit rude and misguided the way that the gun deaths and the gun threat to Australia has been portrayed in the media and most of all our federal government, some of the state governments too. So I did a post on my business page yesterday about an interview we did with the ABC News, and someone commented on there about white men with guns being the biggest threat to Australian security, and that the stats were in. Now, I don't really react to a lot of shit like that, but what I do is take a statement like that, it is obviously very badly thought out and probably just regurgitating some shit from somewhere else, and actually going and looking at the statistics myself and forming my own opinion and trying to have a look at it at a much broader view, so that I have a better understanding of what the problem is, if there is a problem at all, and potentially what we should be focusing on. So I just want to share with you some of the statistics that I found yesterday that, to me, I didn't realise that the problem was this bad. And it sort of rattled me a little bit, because this is a subject that has actually touched my life a fair bit, and I would like to just share some of these with you guys. So the overall gun death trends in Australia. Okay, so these statistics were taken. I've asked AI to help me out with this and just sort of compress everything down so it's easier to understand. But these statistics are basically going back to the 1996 reforms and sort of beyond, because looking at overall statistics for, say the last 20 or 30 years, Australia has had a pretty consistent amount of gun deaths. It goes up and down a little bit, but it's pretty good to take an average on because there's not that many discrepancies. So on average, the annual total of gun deaths in Australia is between 190 to 230 people, which puts it at a rate of 0.7 to 0.9 people per 100,000 of population. Okay, so that is it says here, it's pretty stable to low, and it is a bit lower from the 1996 reforms, when they brought in better licensing structures, safe storage, mental health things, information sharing and that. So it has come down a little bit, but it has been predominantly stable. And before that, the rates weren't much higher, but they were, especially in rural areas. So to break that down, okay, that total of 190 to 230, the suicides actually make up 80 to 85% of those. That's 150 to 165 people a year. That's between 10 and 11 times the death toll at Bondi. And it makes up less than 5% of all suicides. Homicides make up 10 to 15%. So that's 25 to 31 people a year. So that means the Bondi shooting accounts for half of our homicide gun rates in a single calendar year. It is 11 to 12% of all homicides in Australia. That was 31 in 23-24 financial year out of 262 murders. Accidents and undetermined firearm deaths make up for less than 5%. So on average, that is 5 to 13 a year. The yearly, I'll skip that one, it's not really that relevant. The demographics of gun deaths. So the gender, 90 to 93% of gun deaths in Australia are orchestrated by men, and more than 80% of these deaths are men committing suicide. It's a bit of a hard pill to swallow. My cousin was one of those people. The age. Okay, suicides are highest in older men, 60 plus of the thing, at a national average of 41.5 people per 100,000. To put it into perspective, I did do another statistic, and the suicide rate in Australia, the national average is 15.1. So that's considerably higher than the national average. Location, 2 to 3 times higher in remote and rural areas, which is 3.8 versus 1.6 per 100,000 in the cities, and it's tied to occupational access. So obviously, farmers, pest controllers, sporting shooters, a lot of those people are going to live in rural areas, so that will contribute to that. Indigenous rates, they are 2 to 3 times higher than the national average, with their homicide rate being 4.31 to 6.87 per 100,000 versus 0.88 to 0.96 for non-Indigenous people. Homicide perpetrators are 87% male, 20% of those are Indigenous, which does point to a pretty high number considering Indigenous people make up 3% of the Australian population. The motives are often domestic, so domestic abuse, 21 to 34, or acquaintances of those are 26%, and 59% of these homicide rates happen in residential premises. Suicide deaths are higher in isolated and older group. Work stresses make up for more than 55% of cases. So now we're going to have a quick little talk about the occupations that these people are involved in. Top of the list. So just bear in mind, I have had these statistics compressed down, and we can discuss them in more detail if you'd like. But the highest risk by a pretty significant margin are farmers and agricultural workers. So their average, depending on which state they're in, is 24 to 50 people per 100,000. 30% plus of these are attributed to access, mainly, as we said before, rural older men in isolation and financial stress. They are 2 to 3 times higher in Queensland than they are in New South Wales. So I guess there's a lot of reasons for that we could go into, but for the sake of time, we'll just keep pushing on, and as I said, we can discuss those more down the track. The next one is construction workers, FIFO workers and tradies. They are, it doesn't actually break down too much, but they say they make up 22 to 26% of the work-related suicides. The next one, which I found quite disturbing myself, is police and emergency services. So 62 to 70% of their suicide rate involves their guns, and that is 69% above the general population. Many of these are done with their own service pistol, and it's attributed to the trauma that they've been exposed to on the job. After that, we have veterinarians, who are 2 to 4 times the general risk, and then it goes down to they do say with veterinarians their firearm suicides aren't as common as the others, because a lot of the times the veterinarians use the euthanasia drugs they use on the animals. Transport machinery operators make up 9 to 17% of cases, mainly in rural roles. And overall, 10 to 17% of suicides are work-related. Firearm access doubles risk. Rates higher in rural and older males with licenses. The reasons firearms are chosen for suicides, the lethality. So 85 to 92% of people that use a firearm do kill themselves, versus 2 to 8% for overdose, 60 to 85% for hanging. So it's the most lethal method. I would make the argument that it's also it's instantaneous, so there's no like prolonged suffering or whatever that you might get with hanging or overdose or anything like that. But also, unfortunately, once you pull that trigger, there's no going back, is there? At least if you're overdosing, you can call an ambulance. Impulsivity, 24 to 70% attempts decided in less than an hour. So this is like instantaneous, like massive argument with the missus, or freaking out over something's like whatever's going on, caught and catching your wife in bed with your mate, whatever it is. Accessibility, household guns raise risk 2 to 10 times due to their familiarity. Anyway, there's those other statistics that don't really, not part of this conversation. Suicide risk for licensed gun owners. So I found this one very interesting, because this talks about past gun ownership as well, so not necessarily having a current firearms license. So the overall suicide rate for people that have a gun license or had a gun license is 30.4 per 100,000. So it's twice the general population. The firearm suicide rate, this is for current holders. So like me, my partner, a lot of my friends, is only 10.9 per 100,000. So the suicide rate for current firearms owners is about 1/3 below the national average for current holders. And guns are used in only 36% of their suicides. So I found this really interesting, because we keep being like told that guns are the problem, and we need to do all this gun reform, and it's this fucking jackass on Facebook. It's like, no, white men with guns, they're the biggest threat to Australia's safety. It turns out it's not. White men in general, it seems they're killing themselves with firearms at a far higher rate than they're killing anybody else. And that really sort of hits home. I don't think there's anybody in Australia that hasn't been touched by suicide. I know that in my family alone, we've had multiple suicides. I buried a friend last year that hung himself, and it's an epidemic. Our statistics are so much higher than they should be, and I know as a man myself, we kind of get sick of being tarred as the problem. Whereas, like, if you have a look at the highest rates, of firearm related suicide, who were they? Okay, they were the people that grow our food. were the people that protect us. They were the people that build our homes. They mine our minerals for domestic and export. You know, they look after our animals. You know, like these are good people in society. These are careers and occupations that people should aspire to be into. You know, they're some of the greatest people society has to offer. You know, so to paint this picture that somehow these people are bad and they don't, you know, deserve to have firearms, and you know, that's before we take into account, you know, allowing you know, farmers, for example, to be able to do their job properly. You know, I know, you know, Jack out the back did a video, you know, about the West Australia gun reforms, and you know, they're expected to kill feral camels with a 22 Magnum. 22 Magnum's not up to that. We're talking about a hell of a lot of suffering for that animal, and also suffering for the guy that's got to shoot it. You know, this is farmers. These are cattle graziers. These are bloody produce farmers. You know, and you have a look at, you know, the suicide rate in farmers and the reasons for it. You know, and you know, some of these properties have been in their families for generations, and now we find ourselves in a situation where, you know, water rights have you know, and droughts and that have contributed to their, you know, their farms being unsustainable, unproductive. You know, they're isolated. They don't have support networks. You know, anybody who's been around farmers, which, you know, I've lived in the bush, you know, all my adult life. Farmers are some of the hardest working, most dedicated, most patriotic, community spirited people I've ever met. You know, they are responsible for the food that's in front of you every night, regardless of whether that food, you know, came out of a box, came from overseas, or it's something that you know, most of the food we have, unless you've grown it yourself, has originally come from a farmer. So not only are we making it, you know, extremely difficult, you know, especially with, you know, the things they're facing now, bloody green energy companies coming on onto their land, and bloody, you know, like government agencies poisoning fire ants and whatever without permission, and aerial dropping poisons all over their shit. They got all of this stuff to deal with to produce our food, and now the federal government wants to limit the firearms that they can access to be able to do their job properly. Do you think that that's not going to contribute to the declining mental health of farmers? Like, this is just obscene. It's absolutely ridiculous. Ooh, sorry about that. Fuck off. Sorry about that. I knew I should turn it off. But you know, I guess I'll wrap it up now by saying, you know, like I'm going to continue to do videos like this because, you know, the federal government and the state governments, we're very lucky in the territory that we've got the CLP in, because they get it. They're not stupid, you know. But you know, you look at, you know, say the Chris Minns government in New South Wales, and you know, I read the draft of the bill they want to put through for you know, hate speech and gun reform. You know, like these are obviously not being drawn up by people that understand firearms. They're certainly not addressing the actual problem here. We don't. When you look at the gun statistics for Australia year by year, we don't have a gun problem. We have a mental health problem. You know, and those dickheads in Bondi, they're part of that mental health problem. You know, it doesn't matter if you're hurting yourself or hurting somebody else. You know, if you're using your magic little book to justify treating anybody else badly, you're the problem. There's something wrong with you up here. You know, being a good person, comes from within. It doesn't come from a book. You know, and these are the things that we should be addressing, and these are the things that we should be talking about, because a happy, safe country doesn't have huge crime rates. It doesn't have gun problems. It doesn't have machete problems. It doesn't have domestic violence problems. It doesn't have excessive amounts of suicide, which the Australian rate of suicide, the WHO call an epidemic. You know, we shut down the whole country over a few people getting really sick and dying from COVID. Why aren't we up in arms about the suicide rate? Why aren't the abhorrent amounts of male suicide in this country being addressed? Where's the support for these people? You know, we can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on bloody gun buybacks, apparently, which they think is going to cost billions of dollars. You know, we can send hundreds of $millions overseas to humanitarian aid, but when it comes to looking after the people that grow our food, protect us, look after our animals, build our homes, we've got nothing but tumbleweeds. And then on top of all of that, they make us out to be the problem. You know, I don't want to hurt anybody in this world, but I got a gun safe full of firearms over there. I take people with disabilities to the range. I go with my friends to the range, and they've given me a structure and level of responsibility in my life that I sorely needed. You know, I had quite a troubled upbringing with trauma and all of that kind of stuff, and I've been able to overcome that, and I cleaned up my life, and I moved forward and became a constructive member of society. And it just so happens that sport shooting and hunting is something that I gravitate towards, and I love deeply, and I'm pretty good at it. I don't want to hurt anyone. I want everyone to have a good life. I want everybody to flourish and meet all of their goals. I certainly don't want to see anybody even my mate that passed away last year. Geez, I was so thankful he didn't use any of his guns. I've got one of his guns over there. And we pull it out, and it's very sentimental to us. If the Northern Territory was to have a knee-jerk reaction like the other states and not address the actual problem, and we put limits on how many firearms people are allowed to have, I'd have to hand that in. And that's the only thing I have as a memory of my friend, and it's not just for me; it's for everybody else that used to shoot with Nick. So. And I hope you guys find this informative, and I hope I hope you sort of read into things a little bit before you have an opinion on it. Certainly before you start regurgitating shit back on social media and feeling the argument of hate. So thank you for taking the time to watch this.